I remember the first time I laid eyes on the farm. It wasn't much, just a stretch of uneven dirt, a barn that looked like it had survived 3 wars, and a line of apple trees leaning like they'd been arguing with the wind for decades. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt a kind of quiet I hadn't thought I'd ever get back. The city had been a constant hum of alarms, deadlines, and fluorescent lights, but here, the air tasted like earth and rain, like promise. I pulled my jacket tighter against the morning chill, boots sinking slightly into mud, and I imagined what it would feel like to finally own a space that was mine, completely mine. No board meetings, no neighbors looking over fences, no rules I didn't agree to. I stepped up onto the creaking porch and ran a hand along the railing. The paint was peeling, the wood warped and split, but it felt alive. I could almost hear the ghosts of the farm, laughter in the summer, the distant clop of a horse's hooves, the creak of this very porch swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, let it fill my lungs, and for a moment, I could see myself here forever. Hammering shingles on the barn roof, digging holes for new saplings, building a life from the ground up. By evening, the sun was melting across the horizon like honey. I had my boots up on the porch, the wind humming through the broken blades of the old windmill, and I could almost believe the world had stopped just for me. That was when I saw the paper tucked under my windshield wiper, bold black letters, Notice of Pending Association Review. My stomach sank. I had bought this land to escape all of that, to leave rules and committees behind, and yet the first thing that greeted me was bureaucracy, as official and unyielding as a judge in a black robe. I laughed, a little bitter, a little nervous, and shook my head. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into the work of making this farm mine, patching up the barn roof, planting new trees, stringing lights for the first hint of an evening glow. Each nail I hammered felt like staking a claim not just on the land, but on the peace I'd been promised. In town, at Dawson's Hardware, I met Ruth. She was one of those people who seemed stitched together from the history of the town itself. Silver hair, laugh that rumbled like old engines, eyes that could see through walls and intentions. She raised an eyebrow when I mentioned I'd bought the McCallan place. Careful, she warned. Folks out here don't let things go. I nodded, feeling that old tension rise in my chest. But I had plans to make this place mine, no matter what old grudges lingered in the soil. Then, wandering down by the creek, I noticed stakes half buried in mud, stamped with codes and references from some HOA handbook, planted 100 feet inside my property. I felt my jaw tighten. The lines on the land were meant to mark ownership, to tell people where they could and couldn't tread. And yet, these stakes seemed to be mocking me, pointing toward Maple Ridge as if to say, "We decide here." That night, the wind howled through the orchard, rattling the old barn, whispering stories I didn't understand. I stood at the window, tracing the fog as it swallowed the crooked apple trees, and wondered just how many battles a simple piece of land could hold. The next morning, I woke to the soft chatter of birds and the smell of damp earth. I tried to shake off the unease from the letter, telling myself it was just routine, just bureaucracy flexing its muscles. I grabbed my gloves and headed out to the barn, ready to tackle another day of repairs. The sun hit the peeling roof in slanted rays, illuminating dust motes dancing like tiny spirits. I climbed up and started hammering, each strike a rhythm that grounded me, that made me feel alive again. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching. Not people, not yet. Just the kind of lingering scrutiny that comes from knowing someone wants to control what isn't theirs. By mid-morning, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. Down by the hardware store in town, Ruth had insisted I come by for coffee. Her little kitchen smelled of cinnamon and baked bread, and as I sipped, she leaned in, silver hair brushing her shoulders. "Listen," she said, "I've seen this happen before. People come into Maple Ridge thinking they can make their own rules. They can't. Not without a fight. The HOA, they don't just nudge you, they push." Her eyes held a seriousness that made me swallow hard. "You'll need to be ready." I nodded, but I didn't let it scare me. I had deeds, state documents, maps, the works. I had bought this land fair and square. Still, as I drove back down the rutted dirt road to my farm, I felt the weight of history pressing down, like the old trees themselves were whispering warnings. The barn roof was finished by noon, but as I descended the ladder, a dark SUV crested the hill. Its engine growled like a predator, and a woman stepped out, heels sinking slightly into mud, hair perfectly in place despite the morning wind. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We've noticed some activity on your property," she said, voice smooth, practiced. "Construction, repairs. Your land falls under our extended maintenance district." She handed me a pamphlet scented faintly of lavender, printed with logos and legal jargon meant to impress and intimidate. I looked down at my papers, state-stamped and county-approved, and lifted them confidently. "This is county land, always has been. Every line, every boundary, state-certified." Her smile didn't falter, Lines change, communities grow. She left without another word, and the SUV disappeared down the dirt road, leaving a trail of mud and unease in its wake. After she left, I tried to convince myself I could ignore it. I spent the afternoon planting saplings near the creek, using each shovel strike to push away the doubt creeping into my mind. But as the day wore on, letters began to arrive, thick, printed in bulk, each one more threatening than the last. Fines for non-compliance, warnings about structures, even insinuations that my land was in violation of aesthetic standards. They were carefully worded, legal enough to sting, but vague enough to confuse. I stared at them, the edges curling in the breeze, realizing that this wasn't about trees or barns. It was about control, about asserting power where it didn't belong. By evening, I had learned to expect the unexpected. I walked through the orchard, hands brushing against the leaves, listening to the wind whisper through the crooked branches. Somewhere between the rust of the barn and the smell of damp soil, I understood that peace on this farm wouldn't come easy, not because I lacked the means to fight, but because the fight had already begun, quiet and insidious, and I hadn't even seen it coming. And yet, despite it all, a stubborn resolve settled in my chest. I wasn't going to hand this place over without a fight. Not in papers, not in whispers, and certainly not without planting my own roots even. Deeper. The morning started quiet, deceptively quiet, like the calm before a storm that had been circling the edges of my life without me noticing. I was out by the creek checking on the new saplings I'd planted when I saw them, bright orange vests flashing against the green of the fields, heavy machinery parked along my irrigation line. I froze. For a moment I thought maybe it was county work, routine maintenance, but the way they moved, precise, invasive, told a different story. I stomped across the mud, boots sinking deep, and called out, but the foreman didn't flinch. "Storm run off control," he said casually, as if that explained everything, though his eyes never left the line of stakes that had appeared along my property months ago. "Shared property," he added, almost as an afterthought. Shared. The word clung to me like smoke, bitter and invasive. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, calling the sheriff's office as I did. Within the hour, Dan arrived, slow and methodical, calm in a way meant to diffuse a situation that hadn't needed diffusing. My land, my boundaries, my rules. By that afternoon, the tension had become almost physical. I pored over the maps again, tracing the lines that had always been mine. And then I found it. A boundary adjustment request, filed months before I even knew it existed, signed and submitted by Maple Ridge, claiming part of my land as theirs. Pixels and forms, lines redrawn on a screen, my farm being erased one click at a time. I felt my chest tighten, my fingers clenching around the pencil. It wasn't bulldozers or guns. It was a quiet, calculated theft, one that depended on ignorance and patience. I spent the next few days gathering evidence. I dug through historical record, old survey maps and legal filings tracing every previous attempt by the HOA to expand its reach. Every attempt had a pattern, letters, inspections, minor harassment, all designed to wear a person down until they surrendered. But I wasn't going to surrender. Not this time. Not after driving down that dirt road and finally feeling the land under my hands. Night fell, and I stayed inside the barn, lamp on, tracing lines, making notes, and listening to the wind whip around the old roof beams. The sound was familiar, comforting in a way, as though the farm itself understood the battle beginning on its soil. That night, I made a call to Amira, a lawyer and friend who had fought battles in the city that made HOA harassment look like kindergarten. She listened as I rattled off every letter, every stake, every drone sighting. "Send me everything," she said. "They're trying to rewrite reality before they even step on the ground." And then, as if on cue, the sky seemed to join the tension. A drone buzzed over the orchard, red and blue lights blinking like a warning, too precise, too intrusive. My dog barked until it disappeared, but the unease lingered, curling around me like fog. I realized then that this wasn't just a fight over land. It was a fight over the right to decide what that land would be, who could touch it, who could control it, and how far some people were willing to bend the rules to satisfy their own sense of authority. By the end of the week, the letters escalated. Fines multiplied. Threats became sharper. The HOA seemed to anticipate every move I made, each paper I filed, every measurement I took. But with Amira on my side, the fear began to transform into strategy. I was no longer just reacting. I was planning, documenting, preparing for the moment when the quiet war on my land would become visible. I realized then that this battle would not be fought with shovels or nails, but with paper, law, and patience. And I was ready to fight. Days blurred into weeks, but the rhythm of the farm grounded me. The sun still rose over crooked apple trees, and the wind still hummed through the old barn, but the weight of unseen eyes never left. That's when Amira arrived in person, driving up the dirt road with her worn leather satchel, her presence like a calm storm. She'd spent years untangling corporate fraud in the city, and she looked at those letters and drones and boundary claims like they were child's play. "They've been doing this before you arrived," she said, voice steady, eyes scanning the stakes down by the creek. "It's a pattern. They push until someone folds, and then they expand again." We spent hours poring over every document, every parcel map, every HOA filing. There were anomalies in past permits, adjustments filed that didn't match county records, even signatures that looked suspiciously practiced. Each discovery felt like uncovering a buried weapon, the kind that could finally turn the tide. I remember standing in the orchard, sun low, dust catching the light like golden smoke, and feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this quiet war could be won. Ruth stopped by one morning carrying a basket of apples she had picked herself. She leaned on the fence, watching me pace the property lines. "You're digging for answers," she said, almost a statement, almost a warning. "Don't let them make you forget why you're here." I nodded. Her eyes were a tether to reality, reminding me that this fight wasn't just about winning. It was about holding on to the life I'd chosen. We began documenting everything meticulously. Drone sightings, construction crew, letters, stakes, even conversations with Maple Ridge representatives. Amira coached me on how to file subpoenas, how to request audits, how to leverage the patterns of fraud we were uncovering. Each document we pulled felt like another brick in the wall we were building between the HOA's reach and my land. And the more we found, the clearer the picture became. Quiet theft, executed not with force, but with paper and precedent, designed to make the law itself a weapon. Then came the first public break. A neighbor from Maple Ridge, tired of being pushed by the same tactics, reached out with copies of old permits that contradicted the HOA's claims. Each page we added to the pile felt like wind to a flame. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. Others had been victims of the same slow, quiet expansion, the same manipulation of rules to seize land. The battle was no longer just mine, it was ours. Despite the progress, the tension grew. HOA letters arrived faster, inspections became frequent, and anonymous threats slipped under my door. I started sleeping lightly, one ear tuned to the wind or the distant hum of a vehicle on the dirt road. Every shadow of movement, every unexpected sound felt like a test, as if the land itself was asking me whether I had the courage to see this through. And each time I reminded myself why I was here, why this farm mattered. By the end of that month, we had amassed a mountain of evidence, each piece a thread in the tapestry of their overreach. Amira smiled once, leafing through the latest set of documents, and said, "They don't know what they've started. Once we pull this together, it'll be like exposing the gears behind a magician's trick. They won't know how to respond." And for the first time in weeks, I believed her. The quiet war had a battlefield now, and for the first time, I could see the path to victory. The escalation hit like a storm I'd been bracing for but never fully expected. One morning, I went to turn on the water in the shed and found nothing. The tap hissed uselessly and my stomach sank. The county had told me it was jurisdictional review, but I knew better. Maple Ridge had requested oversight. That slow, creeping dread, the kind that snakes into your chest without warning, settled in and refused to leave. I felt exposed, like every boundary line, every tree, every fence post was suddenly up for debate. That afternoon I found tire tracks near the saplings, deep ruts carved into the mud leading straight to the county road. The volunteer crew I'd hired for the irrigation line had been delayed, and now the stakes of this fight felt even heavier. I called Dan, the sheriff, again boots caked in mud, hands shaking slightly from frustration and cold. He came slowly, polite, measured, but his eyes told me the same thing every lawman's eyes tell when they know the law isn't enough. Don't make trouble. Trouble, I realized, was exactly what I was about to make. By nightfall, the letters were relentless. Fines multiplied. Notices of violation appeared on the porch. Anonymous calls whispered threats in the darkness. And then fire came. I woke to the sharp, acrid smell of smoke cutting through the night. Flames hunched over a patch of young trees. Moving too fast, too clean. I grabbed a hose, ran toward it, and saw the volunteer brigade racing alongside me. But even their best efforts couldn't save everything. Saplings, carefully planted, gone. Ash floated on the wind like silent accusations. Amira's voice on the phone that night was steady, urgent, decisive. "This is no accident. Document everything. Tire tracks, footprints, witness statements. We're going to prove intent, not just damage." My hands shook as I grabbed my camera, taking photo after photo, feeling both despair and resolve collide. The FAW. RM had become more than land. It had become a battleground. A test of whether I would cede control or fight with everything I had. The next morning, Maple Ridge representatives arrived in suits, clipboard in hand, smiling as if the fire had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. I refused to be cowed. I stood my ground, showing the county certificates, the historical maps, and the evidence we had compiled over weeks. They spoke in rehearsed lines, shared responsibility, community standards, extended oversight. Each phrase was like a nail meant to pin me down, but I refused to be stationary. I countered with evidence, maps, signatures, and patterns of fraud, slowly eroding their facade of authority. Neighbors began noticing. Farmers from nearby properties, people who had watched Maple Ridge expand their reach quietly for decades, came forward with tips, old permits, and statements. Suddenly, the fight was no longer just mine. Community, long dormant, began to rally around the idea that power could not quietly steal land without consequence. And still, the fire, the water cutoff, the threats, each setback was a reminder that this war was far from over, that resilience would be required in every bone, every thought, every decision. By the time the sun set that evening, I sat in the kitchen, boots muddy, maps spread across the table, and felt the weight of the battle pressing down. But beneath it, buried in the anxiety and frustration, there was a spark of something new. Determination. I wasn't just defending property. I was defending principle, integrity, and the quiet right to exist on land I had earned. And as I traced the lines one more time, the firelight flickering across the walls, I realized the storm had revealed a truth I could no longer ignore. Some battles are won not with force, but with patience, precision, and the courage to keep standing. Everyone expects you to fall. Victory didn't come suddenly, and it didn't come quietly. It came in pieces, in small victories stacked carefully against weeks of intimidation and harassment. The moment the county began to take notice, after Amira filed subpoenas and audits, it felt like the first crack in a dam that had held back justice for far too long. Every forged permit we exposed, every manipulated map we presented, chipped away at the illusion of power Maple Ridge had tried to build around themselves. I remember the first time a county official came to walk the boundaries with me. Boots crunching on the dirt, measuring tape in hand, clipboard filled with certified copies of historical maps and state documents. They looked at the stakes, the crews, the claims, and finally nodded. Lines that had been blurred on paper were restored on the ground. My land, my trees, my barn, they belonged to me again. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for weeks, letting it dissolve into the crisp country air. News of the investigation spread quickly. Local reporters began asking questions. Neighbors who had felt powerless for years came forward, and even some Maple Ridge residents whispered of their own frustrations and the patterns of overreach they had witnessed. Keller, an accountant tied to the HOA, contacted Amira with a shaky voice, providing documents that detailed years of funneling money, forging permits, and stretching authority beyond legal bounds. It was the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Clara Pembroke, the chairwoman, went silent in the face of it. Her confident smiles, the pearls that had once gleamed with authority, now seemed like relics of a story that was unraveling faster than she could respond. Her board scrambled, one resignation after another, trying to salvage credibility as the media painted a clear picture. A community twisted by greed and control, undone by the diligence of one determined landowner. Then came federal protection. Amira had applied for restoration and wetland status for the orchard, citing conservation, environmental history, and the intentional sabotage we had documented. 2 days later, the letter arrived, official and laminated, granting federal protection. I pinned the signs to every fence post, like flags of a quiet but unyielding triumph. The land that had been threatened, undermined, and burned in small ways was untouchable. I walked through the orchard that evening, the wind carrying the scent of wet earth and apple blossoms, listening to the hum of bees returning, the whisper of leaves in the moonlight. The weight of weeks of stress and fear lifted slowly, replaced with a calm that felt earned. Ruth waved from the edge of the field, eyes sparkling with pride. Neighbors greeted me in town differently now, respect in their nods and smiles. This quiet war, the one I had braced for and feared, was over. Not with explosions or dramatic confrontations, but with patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. And as I traced the boundaries once more, looking at the fence lines restored, the barn standing firm, and the saplings reaching for sunlight, I realized something profound. The fight wasn't just about ownership, it was about integrity, about standing for what is right, about proving that even the quietest wars, fought with brains and persistence, can matter. This farm, these trees, this land, they were a testament to that truth. And for the first time in weeks, I could finally breathe, knowing the battle was won, and justice had been done. The days that followed felt different. The wind through the orchard no longer carried a whisper of threat or judgment. It hummed with life, with freedom, with the quiet satisfaction of having stood your ground. The bees returned, buzzing through the apple blossoms like little heralds of restoration. Wildflowers sprouted along the edges of the fence lines, bright colors painting the earth where before there had only been the gray tension of threats and letters. The land seemed to breathe again, and I felt it in my chest too. Ruth stopped by one morning, her eyes glinting with mischief behind the wisdom of age. "Looks like the land remembered what it was supposed to be," she said. I laughed, boots muddy, hair wild from the morning work, and nodded. It wasn't just about the farm, though. The battle had been about something far bigger, about integrity, honesty, and the courage to fight back when the system is designed to grind you down, about proving that patience, knowledge, and determination could outweigh fear, intimidation, and the quiet theft of power. Neighbors began walking the paths of the orchard with me, curious kids asking questions, families pointing at the apple trees, the barn, the restored fences. "Did someone try to take this farm, mister?" one little boy asked, eyes wide with wonder. I knelt beside him, brushing dirt from my hands, and smiled. "They tried," I said, "but this land, it knew better." And so did I. The lesson was simple and profound. Some battles aren't about who shouts the loudest, who wields the most force, or who can intimidate the longest. Sometimes it's about understanding the rules, preparing carefully, and refusing to give in to fear. Sitting on the porch that evening, watching the sun bleed gold across the orchard, I reflected on the strange, quiet war I had fought. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving something to them. It was about protecting what you value, respecting the land, and standing firm when others try to rewrite the world to suit their greed. And in doing so, I realized I hadn't just defended a farm. I had defended a principle, a way of life, and a measure of justice that doesn't need guns or fire or noise to be real. I shared my story with neighbors, friends, and eventually with others who had faced similar quiet battles over land, over truth, over dignity. And the response was overwhelming. People wrote to me sharing their own tales of standing up, of resisting bureaucracy, of fighting for what was theirs even when the odds felt insurmountable. The lesson was universal. Roots may run deep, but stories run even deeper. And the act of defending them can change more than a single plot of land. It can inspire, it can teach, and it can remind everyone that integrity still matters. That night, as the stars stretched across the sky and the orchard lay bathed in moonlight, I understood that the war had never really been about the HOA or the letters, or even the fire. It had been about courage. The courage to hold your ground, to question authority, to act when others expect you to fold. I thought about Clara and her board, about the people who had tried to take what wasn't theirs, and I realized something. Power taken without honor is always temporary, but the quiet strength of someone willing to fight right can last forever. And so I closed the barn door, ran my hand along the fence posts, and walked down the orchard paths, boots squelching in the soft earth. The apples hung heavy on the trees, the bees hummed, and the wind carried nothing but the scent of rain and renewal. I had won the land, yes, but more than that, I had won a deeper understanding of justice, of patience, and of the quiet power of refusing to back down. And as I looked out across the orchard, I thought about all the quiet wars being fought in the world, all the stories waiting to be told, and I hoped that whoever was listening, reading, or watching would find their own courage, and maybe even their own victory, one line in the dirt at a time.